Jake Morrison pushed open the rotting church door, expecting nothing but decay, but instead found a massive chestnut horse standing sentinel over 22 newborn foals scattered across the stone floor. When he read the desperate chalk message scrawled beside them, he dropped to his knees and wept for a woman he had never met. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning mist hung low over the valley as Jake Morrison guided his truck along the old dirt road that cut through his ranch. He had been working this land for 37 years, ever since his father passed it down to him, and he knew every hill, every fence post, every dried creek bed like the lines on his own weathered hands. At 62 years old, Jake had seen his share of strange things out here in the remote countryside of Montana, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover on this particular autumn morning. The day had started like any other. Jake rose before dawn, made his coffee in the same chipped mug he had been using for 2 decades, and headed out to check on his herd. His ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of rolling grassland, dotted with clusters of pine trees and bordered by mountains that turned purple in the evening light. It was hard work maintaining a place this size, especially now that he was getting older and his joints protested every morning. But Jake wouldn't have traded it for anything. This land was in his blood, and the horses he raised here were more than just livestock to him. They were family. As he drove past the northern pasture, something caught his eye. In the distance, beyond the fence line that marked the edge of his property, he could see what looked like movement near the old abandoned church. The structure had been standing there for as long as anyone could remember, a relic from the days when this valley had a thriving community of homesteaders. Now it was just a crumbling stone building with a partially collapsed roof, its windows long since shattered, its wooden pews rotted away. Nobody had set foot in that church for at least 50 years, maybe longer. The locals said it was haunted, though Jake had never put much stock in such stories. But there was definitely something moving around the church. Jake squinted through the dusty windshield of his truck, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. From this distance, it looked like a large animal, maybe a bear or an elk. Whatever it was too close to his property line for comfort. He had calves in the southern pasture that would be vulnerable to predators, and he couldn't afford to lose any livestock this close to winter. Jake turned his truck off the main road and headed toward the church, the vehicle bouncing over the rough terrain as he navigated around rocks and gullies. The closer he got, the more convinced he became that he was looking at a horse, a very large horse. But that didn't make any sense. There were no wild horses in this part of Montana, and all of his own animals were accounted for. He had checked them just yesterday, and every single one was where it was supposed to be. When he was about 100 yards from the church, Jake stopped the truck and stepped out. The morning air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He could hear his own breathing, the distant call of a crow, and something else. A soft nickering sound, the sound horses make when they're calling to each other. Jake's heart began to beat a little faster. He reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a length of rope, more out of habit than any real plan. Then he started walking toward the church. As he approached, the full scene came into view, and Jake stopped dead in his tracks. Standing in front of the church's weathered wooden doors was the largest horse he had ever seen in his life. The animal was a magnificent chestnut with a flowing blonde mane that caught the morning light like spun gold. It stood at least 18 hands high, maybe more, with the powerful build of a draft horse but the elegant bearing of a thoroughbred. Its coat gleamed despite the dust that clung to everything in this dry season, and its eyes were alert and intelligent, watching Jake's approach with what seemed like deliberate calculation. But the horse itself wasn't what made Jake freeze in place. It was what surrounded the horse. Scattered around the entrance to the church, Some lying in the overgrown grass and others standing on wobbly legs were foals. Not just a few foals. Jake counted quickly, his experienced eye taking in the scene. There had to be at least 20 of them, maybe more. They were all small, newborn or close to it, with that fuzzy baby coat that foals have in their first weeks of life. Some were chestnuts like the big horse, others were bays and blacks and even a few pintos. They huddled together in small groups and the giant horse stood watch over them all like a sentinel. Jake's mind raced. This was impossible. Where had all these foals come from? And why were they here, at this abandoned church, in the middle of nowhere? He took a step closer and the big horse shifted its weight, lowering its head slightly. It wasn't an aggressive posture, but it was clear the animal was on guard. Jake had worked with horses his entire life, and he knew when to proceed with caution. He stopped and raised his hand slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice he always used around nervous animals. "Easy there, big fella. I'm not here to hurt anyone, just trying to figure out what's going on here." The horse's ears flicked forward, listening. After a long moment, it seemed to relax slightly, though it never took its eyes off Jake. Encouraged, the rancher took another slow step forward, then another. The foals watched him with wide, curious eyes, but none of them ran. It was as if they knew this giant horse would protect them from any threat. When Jake was close enough to touch the wooden doorframe of the church, he paused and took in the full scene before him. The foals were in various states of health. Some appeared strong and alert, already trying to run on their spindly legs, while others lay quietly in the grass, their sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. The big horse moved between them with surprising grace for its size, occasionally nudging one of the smaller foals with its nose, as if checking on each one individually. Jake had never seen anything like this protective behavior, not even from the best mother horses on his ranch. He noticed something else too. Inside the church, visible through the half-open door and the gaps where the walls had crumbled, there was hay, fresh hay, scattered across the stone floor, and water troughs, the kind you could buy at any farm supply store. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been taking care of these animals. But who? And more importantly, why would anyone abandon so many foals at an old abandoned church? Jake carefully circled around to get a better look inside the building without startling the big horse. As he moved, the animal tracked him with its eyes but didn't seem aggressive, just watchful. When Jake peered through one of the broken windows, what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The interior of the church, which he had always assumed was nothing but rubble and decay, had been transformed into a makeshift stable. Someone had cleared away years of debris, shored up the damaged sections of roof with wooden beams, and created individual stalls using old wooden pallets and chicken wire. There were bags of feed stacked in one corner, blankets folded neatly on an old pew, and veterinary supplies organized on what must have once been the altar. But it was what he saw on the floor that made Jake's blood run cold. Written in white chalk on the ancient stone floor, in large, desperate letters, was a message. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in great distress or pain. Jake had to step inside to read it fully, and the big horse allowed him to pass, stepping aside as if it understood that Jake needed to see what was written there. The message read, "I am dying. Cancer. No family left. These are rescue foals, all rejected or orphaned. I used my last money to save them. The big horse is thunder. He will protect them. Please, whoever finds this, give them a chance. They deserve to live. God bless you, Margaret Sullivan." Jake read the words 3 times, his eyes stinging with unexpected tears. Margaret Sullivan. He knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. She had been a legendary horse rescuer, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to saving abused and abandoned horses. She ran a sanctuary about 40 miles from here, or at least she used to. Jake had heard rumors that she had closed down her operation a few months back due to health problems, but he had assumed she had simply retired and moved away. He never imagined this. The rancher looked back at Thunder, the giant horse standing guard at the entrance. Now it all made sense. Margaret must have known she was dying. She must have known she couldn't care for these foals anymore, and rather than surrender them to a system that might separate them, or worse, put them down, she had brought them here, to this old church on the edge of Jake's property, a place hidden from the world. She had set up everything they needed to survive, at least for a while, and she had entrusted their care to Thunder, a horse she clearly believed would protect them until someone found them. Jake pulled out his phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal out here. There never was. He would have to drive back to the ranch house to make calls, to contact the veterinarian, to figure out what to do with 22 foals and one massive guardian horse. But before he did that, he needed to make sure these animals had everything they needed right now. He walked back to his truck and grabbed the emergency supplies he always kept in the bed, a few bottles of water, some grain, and a first aid kit that included items for both humans and animals. Thunder watched as Jake returned with the supplies, and this time the horse seemed to recognize that this human meant no harm. The big animal even stepped aside to let Jake approach the foals more closely. Jake knelt down beside the weakest-looking one, a tiny bay filly who couldn't have been more than a few days old. She was breathing, but barely, and her eyes had that glazed look that Jake had seen too many times before. This little one was in trouble. He gently lifted the filly, surprised by how light she was, and carried her to a spot where the morning sun was starting to break through the trees. The warmth would help, at least a little. Thunder followed him, standing close by as if supervising Jake's actions. The rancher pulled out his water bottle and moistened the filly's lips, trying to get her to drink. After a few moments, her tongue moved slightly, accepting the water. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jake spent the next hour moving from foal to foal, checking each one, offering water to those who would take it, and making mental notes of which ones needed immediate veterinary attention. Thunder never left his side, and gradually Jake began to understand the intelligence behind those large dark eyes. This wasn't just a horse protecting a herd. This was a horse who had been given a mission, a sacred trust, and he was determined to fulfill it no matter what. By the time Jake finished his initial assessment of all the foals, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist and warming the air around the old church. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard ground, and his back protested as he stood up, but these discomforts barely registered in his mind. All he could think about was the massive responsibility that had just landed in his lap. 22 foals, some healthy, some sick, all of them completely dependent on care and attention they wouldn't survive without, and one giant horse who had somehow managed to keep them all alive until now. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Thunder, who stood in the same spot near the church entrance, his massive head turning occasionally to check on the foals scattered around him. The horse hadn't eaten or drunk anything since Jake had arrived, hadn't moved more than a few steps from his post. It was clear that Thunder took his role as guardian seriously, perhaps more seriously than any animal Jake had ever encountered. The rancher felt a surge of respect for this magnificent creature, mixed with a deep sadness for what Margaret Sullivan must have gone through in her final days, setting all this up, knowing she was leaving these innocent lives in the hands of fate and one loyal horse. He needed to make decisions, and he needed to make them fast. The weakest foals couldn't wait for a committee meeting or a lengthy discussion about options. They needed immediate medical attention, proper nutrition, and warmth. Jake pulled out his notebook from his shirt pocket, the same one he used to track breeding schedules and veterinary appointments for his own horses, and started making a list. First priority, get the vet out here. Second, transport the sickest foals back to his ranch where he had proper facilities. Third, figure out what to do with the rest of them, including Thunder. As he wrote, a thought occurred to him that made his pen pause mid-sentence. What if Thunder wouldn't let the foals leave? The horse had been entrusted with their protection, and for all Jake knew, Thunder might interpret any attempt to separate them as a threat. He looked up at the big horse, studying him carefully. Thunder was watching him back, those intelligent eyes seeming to read Jake's very thoughts. The rancher decided to test his theory. He walked slowly toward one of the healthier foals, a sturdy little colt with a black coat that shone like polished obsidian. The colt was curious and friendly, approaching Jake without fear and sniffing at his outstretched hand. Jake gently placed his hand on the colt's neck, half expecting Thunder to react. The big horse's ears swiveled forward, paying attention, but he made no move to intervene. Encouraged, Jake began to lead the colt a few steps away from the group, toward his truck. That's when Thunder moved. The giant horse didn't charge or act aggressively. Instead, he simply walked over and positioned himself between Jake and the truck, blocking the path. It was a clear message delivered without hostility but with absolute firmness. The foals weren't going anywhere without Thunder's approval. Jake stopped and released the colt, who trotted back to join the others. Thunder watched until the colt was safely back with the group, then returned to his sentinel position. Jake sighed and ran his hand through his graying hair. This was going to be more complicated than he thought. He couldn't help the foals if he couldn't move them, and he couldn't move them without Thunder's cooperation. He needed a different approach. Walking back to the church entrance, Jake positioned himself where Thunder could see him clearly and started talking. It was something he had always done with horses, talking to them like they were people. Some folks thought it was foolish, but Jake had always believed horses understood more than most people gave them credit for. Listen, Thunder, I know Margaret left you in charge here. I know you're doing exactly what she told you to do, and I respect that, but some of these little ones are sick, really sick. If we don't get them help soon, they're not going to make it. I'm not trying to take them away from you. I'm trying to save them, same as you are. I've got a ranch just over those hills. Good pastures, warm stables, medicine, everything they need. I'm asking you to trust me, the way Margaret must have trusted you. Thunder's ears flicked back and forth as Jake spoke, and the horse tilted his head slightly as if considering the rancher's words. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Thunder walked over to the weakest foal, the little bay filly Jake had given water to earlier. The big horse gently nudged her with his nose, then looked at Jake. It was the clearest communication Jake had ever received from an animal. Thunder was telling him to take her. Jake's throat tightened with emotion as he carefully picked up the filly, cradling her against his chest. She was so small, so fragile, her heart beating rapidly against his arms. Thunder followed him all the way to the truck, watching as Jake settled the filly on a bed of blankets he had laid out in the back seat. The horse stood there for a moment, and Jake could have sworn he saw sadness in those deep brown eyes. Then Thunder turned and walked back to the rest of the foals. Jake started the truck and began the drive back to his ranch, checking frequently in the rearview mirror to make sure the filly was still breathing. His mind was already racing ahead, planning what needed to be done. He would call Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who had been caring for his horses for the past decade. She was one of the best in the state, and more importantly, she had a heart for rescue cases. If anyone could help him save these foals, it was Sarah. The 15-minute drive back to the ranch felt like an eternity. Jake kept one hand on the steering wheel and kept glancing back at the tiny filly wrapped in blankets on the back seat. Each time he looked, his heart squeezed with worry. She was so still, barely moving except for the shallow rise and fall of her small chest. He pushed the truck a little faster, the vehicle bouncing over the rough ranch road, knowing that every second counted. When he finally pulled up to the main barn, Jake's border collie Scout came running out to greet him as usual, tail wagging with excitement. But Jake had no time for the dog's enthusiastic welcome. He carefully lifted the filly from the back seat and carried her straight into the barn. Heading for the foaling stall, he kept prepared year-round for emergencies. The stall was clean and filled with fresh straw, and the morning sun streaming through the high windows provided natural warmth. He laid the filly down gently, making sure her head was elevated slightly, and covered her with another blanket. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Sarah Chen's number, praying she would answer. It was early, but Sarah was known for being an early riser, often heading out to farms before most people finished their first cup of coffee. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar voice came through. "This is Dr. Chen. Sarah, it's Jake Morrison. I need you to come out to my ranch right away. It's an emergency." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice shifted into professional mode. "What's going on, Jake? Is it one of your mares?" "No, it's not one of mine." Jake took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain what he had found. "Sarah, I need you to trust me on this. I've got a situation that's hard to describe over the phone. I've got a critically ill foal here that needs immediate attention, and there are 21 more out at the old church on my north property line, plus 1 massive draft horse who's been guarding them." The silence on the other end lasted several heartbeats. "Jake, are you saying there are 22 foals at the abandoned church?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. They're rescue foals. Margaret Sullivan's rescues. She left a message before she died. The big horse, Thunder, has been protecting them, but some of them won't make it without help. Margaret Sullivan." Sarah's voice softened with recognition and sadness. "I heard she had passed away a few weeks ago. I had no idea about any of this. Jake, I'm 20 minutes out. I'll be there as fast as I can. In the meantime, keep that foal warm and see if you can get any fluids into her. Even just a few drops of water on her tongue can help." "Already done." Jake looked down at the filly, whose eyes were now closed. "Just hurry, Sarah." After ending the call, Jake sat down on an overturned bucket next to the stall, suddenly feeling the weight of his 62 years. His body ached from the morning's activities, but more than that, his heart ached for Margaret Sullivan, a woman he had never met but whose final act of love had been to try to save these innocent animals. He wondered what her last days had been like, setting up that makeshift stable in the old church, hauling feed and water, making sure Thunder and the foals had everything they needed, all while battling cancer, all alone, with no family to help her. The filly stirred slightly, drawing Jake's attention back to the present. He reached over and gently stroked her soft coat, murmuring words of encouragement. "You're going to be okay, little one. We're going to get you through this." He had no idea if his words were true, but he needed to believe them. Needed to believe that Margaret's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. Scout, the border collie, had followed Jake into the barn and now sat quietly at his feet, seeming to sense the gravity of the situation. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder that Jake wasn't completely alone in this. He reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears, grateful for the simple companionship. True to her word, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived in 18 minutes, her white veterinary truck kicking up dust as it sped down the ranch driveway. She was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, grabbing her medical bag from the back and jogging toward the barn. Sarah was in her early 40s, with short black hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing. She had been a veterinarian for nearly 20 years, and in that time she had seen just about everything. But even she looked shocked when Jake quickly filled her in on the details as they walked to the foaling stall. When Sarah knelt beside the filly and began her examination, her expression turned serious. The little horse's vital signs were weak, her temperature below normal, and she showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. Sarah worked quickly, pulling supplies from her bag, IV fluids, antibiotics, vitamins. She inserted a small catheter into the filly's leg with practiced efficiency, and hooked up a drip bag, all while explaining what she was doing to Jake. She's hypothermic and severely dehydrated. Probably hasn't been nursing properly, if at all. Without her mother, she wouldn't have gotten the colostrum she needed in those first critical hours. Her immune system is compromised, which means she's vulnerable to infection. Sarah paused in her work to look up at Jake. "I'm going to be honest with you, Jake. She's in bad shape. The next few hours are critical. If she makes it through the day, her chances improve significantly." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "What can I do?" "Keep her warm. Monitor her constantly. If she shows any signs of distress, call me immediately. I'm going to leave you with some supplies and instructions." Sarah stood up and looked toward the barn entrance, as if she could see through the walls to the distant church. "And then we need to talk about the other 21 foals. We need to get out there and assess each one. Some of them might be in similar condition or worse. I know." Jake ran his hand over his face. "But there's a complication. Thunder, the big horse guarding them, he's not going to just let us walk in and start taking foals. He only let me take this one because he could see she was dying." Sarah listened carefully as Jake explained Thunder's behavior, how the massive horse had blocked his path when he tried to lead one of the healthier foals away, and how he had only allowed the weakest filly to be taken. She nodded thoughtfully, her mind already working through the challenge. In her years as a veterinarian, she had dealt with protective mares, aggressive stallions, and traumatized rescue horses, but a horse who had been specifically tasked with guarding a group of orphaned foals was something entirely new. "We need to approach this differently," Sarah said, packing her supplies back into her bag. "Thunder isn't being difficult or aggressive. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do, what Margaret entrusted him to do. We need to show him that we're not a threat, that we're actually helping to fulfill Margaret's wishes." She paused, thinking. "Do you have a trailer big enough to transport multiple foals at once?" Jake nodded. "I've got my large stock trailer. It can hold 6, maybe 8 foals comfortably, depending on their size." "Good. Here's what I'm thinking. We go out there together with the trailer, with feed, with medical supplies. We don't rush anything. We let Thunder see us caring for the foals right there at the church. We treat the ones that need immediate attention on site. And then slowly, we see if he'll allow us to move them. If we have to, we make multiple trips over several days. The important thing is earning his trust." Jake looked down at the filly, who seemed slightly more responsive now that the IV fluids were flowing into her system. "And what about her?" "I can't leave her alone. I'll call my assistant Marcus. He can stay here and monitor her while we're gone." Sarah was already pulling out her phone. He's worked with critical foals before. He'll know what to watch for. Within 30 minutes, Marcus arrived, a young man in his mid-20s with gentle hands and a calm demeanor that animals seemed to trust instinctively. Sarah briefed him quickly on the filly's condition, showed him the medication schedule, and made him promise to call immediately if anything changed. Then she and Jake loaded the truck with everything they might need: more IV fluids, antibiotics, syringes, bottles for feeding, heat lamps, blankets, and bags of high-quality foal feed and mare's milk replacer. The drive back to the church felt different this time. Jake wasn't alone anymore. Having Sarah beside him, with her expertise and her calm confidence, made the impossible task ahead seem slightly more manageable. They talked as they drove, and Sarah shared what she knew about Margaret Sullivan. She had met the woman twice at veterinary conferences, had heard her speak passionately about horse rescue and rehabilitation. Margaret had been a force of nature, Sarah said, the kind of person who would give everything she had to save an animal, even if it meant she had nothing left for herself. When they arrived at the church, Thunder was exactly where Jake had left him, standing guard near the entrance. The big horse's head lifted as the truck approached, and his ears swiveled forward with alert attention. Jake parked at a respectful distance, not wanting to alarm the animal. As he and Sarah climbed out and began unloading supplies, Thunder watched their every move. Sarah's breath caught when she saw the full scope of what they were dealing with. The foals were scattered around the church grounds, some playing together in small groups, others resting in the shade. Thunder stood among them like a majestic statue, his presence both beautiful and imposing. "My God," Sarah whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." They approached slowly, carrying bags of feed and medical supplies. Jake spoke to Thunder as they walked, using the same calm tone he had used earlier. "Thunder, we're back. We brought help. This is Dr. Chen. She's a good person, just like Margaret was. We're going to take care of your foals, I promise." Thunder didn't move, but his eyes tracked them, evaluating, judging. When they were about 20 feet away, the horse took a few steps forward, positioning himself between them and the foals. It was the same protective response Jake had seen before. Sarah stopped and set down her bags, then did something that surprised Jake. She sat down on the ground, cross-legged, making herself smaller, less threatening. She began talking to Thunder in a soft, gentle voice. "Hey there, big guy. You've done such a good job taking care of these babies. Margaret chose well when she trusted you with them, but I bet you're tired, aren't you? I bet you've been awake for days watching over them, making sure they're safe. I bet you're hungry and thirsty, and you just want to rest. We're not here to take them away from you. We're here to help you take care of them. Will you let us help you?" Thunder's ears flicked back and forth as Sarah spoke. The horse took a step closer to her, then another. Jake held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever connection was forming between the veterinarian and the guardian horse. Thunder lowered his massive head and sniffed at Sarah's outstretched hand. She remained perfectly still, letting the horse investigate her, learn her scent, decide for himself if she could be trusted. After what felt like an eternity, Thunder took one more step forward and gently touched his nose to Sarah's hand. It was a gesture of acceptance. Sarah smiled and slowly raised her other hand to stroke the horse's soft muzzle. "Good boy, Thunder, good boy. You've been so brave, so strong, but you don't have to do this alone anymore." With Thunder's tentative acceptance, Sarah and Jake were able to begin their work. They moved slowly and deliberately, always keeping the big horse in their line of sight, always talking to him, narrating what they were doing so he would understand their intentions. Sarah started by examining the foals closest to them, running her experienced hands over their small bodies, checking for signs of illness, malnutrition, or injury. Jake took notes on a clipboard, creating a record of each foal's condition. The first one Sarah examined was a little Palomino colt with a star-shaped white mark on his forehead. He was curious and playful, trotting up to Sarah without fear and nuzzling at her pockets, probably hoping for treats. Sarah smiled as she checked him over. "This one's in good shape," she announced. "Good weight, bright eyes, strong heartbeat. He's been nursing or eating well." She pulled out a syringe and gave him a vitamin shot, which the colt barely seemed to notice. "He'll be fine with proper care." They moved through the foals systematically, and a pattern began to emerge. About half of them were relatively healthy, showing signs that they had been receiving adequate nutrition and care. These were the stronger ones, the fighters who had managed to adapt to the unusual circumstances, but the other half told a different story. They were thin, lethargic, some with dull coats and runny eyes. These were the ones who were struggling, the ones who desperately needed intervention. Sarah worked tirelessly, examining each foal with gentle thoroughness. She administered fluids to the dehydrated ones, antibiotics to those showing signs of infection, and nutritional supplements to all of them. Jake helped where he could, holding the foals steady while Sarah worked, offering comfort with soft words and gentle touches. Thunder watched it all, sometimes coming close to observe what they were doing to a particular foal, other times maintaining his distance but always keeping vigil. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jake began to notice details about Thunder that he had missed in his initial assessment. The horse's coat, while still impressive, was dusty and unkempt. There were burrs tangled in his mane and tail, and his hooves showed signs of neglect. Most telling were the hollows visible along his ribs. Thunder had been so focused on caring for the foals that he had been neglecting his own needs. How long had it been since he had eaten a proper meal? How many nights had he stood guard without rest? Jake walked over to where they had stacked the supplies and grabbed a bag of high-quality grain, the kind he fed his own horses. He poured a generous amount into a bucket and carried it over to Thunder. The horse's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the food, and for the first time since Jake had arrived that morning, Thunder's attention shifted away from the foals. The big horse lowered his head to the bucket and began to eat, not frantically, but with the steady determination of an animal that had been running on empty for far too long. While Thunder ate, Jake filled another bucket with fresh water from the containers they had brought. Thunder drank deeply, and Jake could see the gratitude in the horse's eyes. It was a small thing, providing food and water, but in that moment, Jake felt like he was honoring Margaret Sullivan's memory. She had taken care of Thunder, and now it was Jake's turn to do the same. Sarah called out from across the clearing, "Jake, I need you over here." There was an urgency in her voice that made Jake's stomach tighten. He jogged over to where Sarah was kneeling beside a small chestnut filly. The foal was lying on her side, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes glazed with fever. "This one's in bad shape," Sarah said quietly. "Pneumonia, I think. She's burning up. We need to get her back to the clinic right away. I don't have the equipment here to treat this." Jake looked at Thunder, who had finished eating and was now watching them intently. The horse had seen them load the first filly into the truck that morning, and he had allowed it because he understood she was dying. But would he allow another to be taken? Jake approached Thunder slowly, speaking as he walked. "Thunder, this little one is very sick. She needs medicine we don't have here. We need to take her to a place where we can help her, just like the first one. You understand that, don't you?" Thunder's ears swiveled forward, listening. The horse walked over to the sick filly and sniffed at her gently, as if assessing her condition himself. Then, in a gesture that made Jake's throat tighten with emotion, Thunder carefully nudged the filly with his nose, as if saying goodbye. He stepped back and looked at Jake, and the message was clear. Take her. Save her. Jake carefully lifted the filly, cradling her against his chest, as he had done with the first one. She was heavier than the bay filly had been, but still heartbreakingly light. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and some additional supplies, and together they walked to the truck. Thunder followed them part way, then stopped and watched as they loaded the filly into the back seat, surrounded by blankets to keep her stable during the journey. Before they drove away, Sarah turned to Jake with a concerned expression. "We can't keep doing this one at a time," she said. "Some of these foals need immediate care, and we're running out of time. We need to bring more of them back to your ranch today, especially the sick ones. But I don't know if Thunder will allow that many to leave at once." Jake looked back at the church where Thunder stood framed in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the ancient stone. "We have to try," he said. "We have to make him understand that we're not abandoning them. We're saving them." They drove the sick filly back to the ranch, where Marcus reported that the first filly had stabilized and was even trying to stand. It was the first piece of good news in a day filled with heartbreak and challenge. Sarah immediately began treating the chestnut filly, setting up another IV line and administering medication for the pneumonia. After ensuring both fillies were stable and under Marcus's watchful care, Jake and Sarah returned to the church with the large stock trailer hitched to the truck. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and the temperature had risen considerably, making Jake worry about the foals who had no access to proper shade or shelter. They needed to move faster, but they also needed to be careful not to break the fragile trust they had built with Thunder. When they arrived, Thunder was lying down for the first time since Jake had discovered him that morning. The big horse was stretched out on his side near a cluster of foals, his eyes half closed but still alert. The moment he heard the truck, his head lifted and his ears swiveled toward them. Jake felt a pang of guilt for disturbing what was probably the first rest Thunder had allowed himself in days, maybe weeks. Sarah approached on foot while Jake stayed back with the trailer. She carried a bucket of grain and some apple slices, a peace offering for the exhausted guardian. Thunder rose to his feet with surprising grace for an animal of his size and walked over to meet her. He accepted the treats, munching contentedly, while Sarah stroked his neck and spoke to him in that same gentle voice she had used before. "Thunder, we need to take more of the babies today. The sick ones can't wait any longer. I know you want to keep them all together, and I understand that, but some of them will die if we don't get them proper medical care. Margaret wouldn't want that. She saved them once, and now we need to save them again. Will you help us?" The horse finished the last apple slice and looked at Sarah with those deep, intelligent eyes. Then he did something that made both Sarah and Jake catch their breath. Thunder walked over to the trailer, which Jake had opened and prepared with soft bedding, and he sniffed at it thoroughly, investigating every corner. He seemed to be assessing whether it was safe, whether the foals would be comfortable inside. After his inspection, Thunder looked back at Sarah and Jake, then walked to where several of the sicker foals were resting. One by one, Thunder approached each of the weakest foals and gently nudged them with his nose, encouraging them to stand. It was as if he was selecting which ones needed to go first, using his own judgment to triage the situation. Jake watched in amazement as the big horse shepherded 3 foals toward the trailer, a small bay colt and 2 fillies, one gray and one brown with white socks. The foals, who clearly trusted Thunder completely, followed his lead without hesitation. Sarah and Jake moved quickly but carefully, helping the foals into the trailer and making sure they were comfortable and secure. Thunder stood at the trailer's entrance, watching every movement, ensuring that his charges were being handled gently. When all 3 foals were loaded, Thunder stepped back, but Jake could see the conflict in the horse's posture. Every instinct Thunder had was telling him not to let the foals out of his sight, but he was choosing to trust these humans. It was an act of faith that moved Jake deeply. "We'll bring them back to visit," Jake promised Thunder. "Once they're healthy, we'll bring them back so you can see them. You have my word." They made the trip back to the ranch, and with Marcus's help, they set up the 3 new foals in separate stalls. Each one received a thorough examination, medication, and food. The bay colt was severely underweight but perked up considerably once he had a full belly. The gray filly had an infected wound on her leg that Sarah cleaned and bandaged. The brown filly with white socks was the most concerning, showing signs of severe dehydration and possible organ stress. As Sarah worked on the brown filly, inserting an IV line and administering emergency fluids, she talked to Jake about the bigger picture. "We've got 5 foals here now, and there are still 17 at the church. We need more help, Jake. We need more space, more hands, more resources. This is bigger than what you and I can handle alone." Jake knew she was right. His ranch, while substantial, wasn't equipped to handle 22 rescue foals, plus Thunder. He had his own horses to care for, his regular ranch work to maintain, and the costs were already mounting up: veterinary supplies, feed, medication, labor. He wasn't a wealthy man, and his savings would only stretch so far. But the alternative, giving up on these foals, was unthinkable. "What do you suggest, he asked, washing his hands in the barn sink. Sarah finished securing the IV bag and stood up, brushing straw from her jeans. "We need to reach out to the community." Margaret Sullivan was well known in horse rescue circles. If people knew what was happening, if they understood what she did in her final days, I think they would want to help. We could set up a fundraiser, get volunteers, maybe even find foster homes for some of the foals once they're healthy enough. Jake nodded slowly. The idea of opening this up to strangers made him uncomfortable. He was a private man, not someone who asked for help easily, but this wasn't about him. This was about Margaret's legacy, about Thunder's dedication, about 22 innocent lives that deserved a chance. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it. But I want to make one thing clear. Thunder stays with me. No matter what happens, that horse has a home here for the rest of his life." Sarah smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." That evening, after making another trip to the church to bring back 2 more sick foals, Jake and Sarah sat on the porch of his ranch house, exhausted but determined. Sarah had already started making phone calls to other veterinarians, to rescue organizations, to the local news station. Word was spreading fast about the miracle at the old church, about the guardian horse who had protected 22 orphaned foals, about the rancher who had discovered them and refused to give up. By the next morning, Jake's phone was ringing nonstop. The local news had run a story about the rescue, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over the county were calling, offering help, donations, supplies, even their own barns as temporary foster locations. Jake, who had lived quietly on his ranch for decades, suddenly found himself at the center of a community effort that touched him more than he could have imagined. A woman named Patricia drove 3 hours from Billings with a truck full of full milk replacer and bottles. She had lost her own rescue horse the previous year and wanted to honor its memory by helping Margaret's foals. A retired rancher named Tom showed up with his grandson, offering to build additional stalls and help with daily care. The local feed store delivered 10 bags of grain and refused to accept payment. Even the town's small diner sent over meals for Jake and the volunteers, understanding that nobody had time to cook with so much work to do. Sarah coordinated the medical efforts, bringing in 2 other veterinarians she trusted to help with examinations and treatment. Together, they created a comprehensive care plan for each foal. The sickest ones remained at Jake's ranch under constant supervision, while the healthier ones were being prepared for transport to foster homes once they passed medical clearance. But through it all, one question remained unanswered: what to do about Thunder and the remaining foals still at the church? Jake made the trip back to the church every day, sometimes twice a day. Each time he brought food and water for Thunder, spending time with the big horse, talking to him, building their relationship. Thunder had allowed them to take 10 foals so far, always choosing which ones should go, always saying his gentle goodbye to each one. But Jake could see the toll it was taking on the guardian horse. Thunder was eating better now and getting more rest, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a loneliness that came from watching his charges leave one by one. On the 4th day, Jake arrived at the church to find Thunder standing in the doorway, looking out across the empty clearing. Most of the foals were gone now, only 5 remained, and they were the healthiest of the group, the ones who didn't need immediate medical intervention. Thunder turned when he heard Jake's truck, and for the first time the horse walked toward him without hesitation, meeting him halfway across the clearing. Jake set down the bucket of grain he had brought and simply stood there, allowing Thunder to approach on his own terms. The big horse walked right up to him and lowered his massive head, pressing his forehead gently against Jake's chest. It was a gesture of trust, of connection, perhaps even of grief. Jake wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, feeling the warmth of the horse's body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You've done everything Margaret asked of you," Jake said quietly. "You kept them safe. You protected them when they had no one else. But your job is done now, Thunder. It's time for you to rest, to let someone else take care of you for a change." Thunder stood there for a long moment, then pulled back and looked Jake directly in the eyes. In that gaze, Jake saw intelligence, sorrow, and something else, a question. "What happens to me now?" The unspoken words were as clear as if Thunder had spoken them aloud. Jake knew that this magnificent horse had spent so long focused on his mission that he probably had no idea what came next, whether there would be a place for him in this new reality. "You're coming home with me," Jake said firmly. "You and these last 5 foals, all of you together. I've got pastures where you can run, a warm stall for the cold nights, and all the grain you can eat. And more than that, Thunder, you'll have a purpose. You'll help me train these foals as they grow, teach them how to be strong and brave like you. What do you say?" Thunder's ears pricked forward, and though Jake knew it was probably his imagination, he could have sworn the horse understood every word. That afternoon, with the help of Tom and his grandson, they loaded the last 5 foals into the trailer. This time, Thunder didn't resist or supervise anxiously. Instead, he walked into the trailer himself, positioning himself in the center so the foals could gather around him. It was the first time Thunder had willingly left the church since Margaret had brought him there. The drive back to the ranch was slow and careful, Jake constantly checking the rearview mirror to make sure Thunder and the foals were comfortable. When they finally arrived, a small crowd had gathered, volunteers and donors, who had heard that the legendary guardian horse was finally coming home. They stood at a respectful distance as Jake opened the trailer and Thunder emerged, his hooves hitting the solid ground of the ranch, his eyes taking in his new surroundings. Sarah was there, and she approached Thunder with a smile, offering him an apple from her pocket. "Welcome home, big guy," she said softly. Thunder accepted the apple, and then, to everyone's amazement, he walked straight to the large pasture Jake had prepared and stopped at the fence, looking out over the green grass and the other horses grazing in the distance. The 5 foals followed him, staying close to their protector even in this new place. Jake opened the gate and Thunder walked through, the foals trailing behind him like ducklings following their mother. The big horse walked to the center of the pasture, then turned in a slow circle, surveying his new domain. Finally, he lowered his head to the grass and began to graze. It was a simple act, but to Jake, it meant everything. Thunder was accepting this place, claiming it as his own, allowing himself to finally let down his guard. The volunteers erupted in quiet applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. This wasn't just about saving horses anymore. It was about honoring a promise, about completing a mission that a dying woman had started, about showing that loyalty and love could triumph even in the darkest circumstances. Thunder had done his part, and now the community was doing theirs. The weeks that followed were filled with both triumph and heartbreak. Of the 22 foals that Thunder had protected, 20 survived. The 2 they lost had been too weak, their tiny bodies too ravaged by neglect before Margaret had rescued them. Jake held each one as they passed, whispering words of comfort, making sure they didn't die alone. He buried them on a hillside overlooking the ranch, planting wildflowers on their graves. Thunder stood vigil at those burials, his head bowed as if understanding that despite everyone's best efforts, not every battle could be won. But the 20 who survived began to thrive in ways that amazed even Sarah. The first little bay filly, the one Thunder had first allowed Jake to take, grew stronger each day. They named her Hope, and she became a symbol of everything this rescue represented. She would gallop around her paddock on wobbly legs, her dark eyes bright with life, a far cry from the dying creature Jake had cradled in his arms that first morning. The community's support never wavered. A local carpenter built a memorial plaque that Jake mounted at the entrance to the barn. It read, "In memory of Margaret Sullivan, who gave everything to save those who couldn't save themselves, and to Thunder, the guardian who kept her promise." Every time Jake walked past that plaque, he felt a connection to the woman he had never met, a kinship with someone who understood that some things were worth sacrificing for. Thunder's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. In those first weeks at the ranch, the big horse had been restless, constantly checking on the foals, barely eating, never fully relaxing. But gradually, as he saw that the foals were safe and cared for, that Jake and the volunteers were fulfilling Margaret's mission, Thunder began to let go of some of his burden. He started to play, something Jake suspected the horse hadn't done in years, maybe ever. He would run through the pasture with the foals chasing after him, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly across the ground, his mane and tail flowing like banners in the wind. Jake spent hours with Thunder every day, grooming him, talking to him, simply being present. The horse's coat, once dull and dusty, now gleamed like polished copper in the sunlight. His hooves, which Sarah had trimmed and treated, were healthy and strong. But more than his physical transformation, it was Thunder's spirit that had changed. The constant vigilance, the weight of responsibility that had defined him for so long had eased. He was still watchful, still protective of the foals, but now he allowed himself moments of peace, moments where he could just be a horse. One evening, as Jake sat on the fence watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thunder walked over and stood beside him. The horse's presence was calming, solid, a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections required no words. Jake reached out and stroked Thunder's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the skin, the warmth of life that Margaret Sullivan had worked so hard to preserve. "You know," Jake said quietly, "I've been thinking about Margaret a lot lately. About what her last days must have been like, knowing she was dying, knowing these foals would be alone. It must have terrified her. But she had you, didn't she? She knew that if anyone could keep them safe until help arrived, it was you." Thunder's ear swiveled toward Jake's voice, listening. "And you did it, boy. Against all odds, you did exactly what she asked." The foals had begun finding their forever homes. Sarah had carefully vetted each potential adopter, ensuring they understood the special nature of these horses, the legacy they carried. A young girl named Emma adopted Hope, and Jake would never forget the tears streaming down the child's face when she wrapped her arms around the filly's neck. A retired veteran took 2 of the colts, saying he needed them as much as they needed him. Each adoption was bittersweet, but Jake took comfort in knowing that Margaret's final act of love was creating ripples of joy and healing throughout the community. But Thunder remained at the ranch, and Jake had no intention of ever letting him leave. The big horse had become an integral part of the daily rhythm of ranch life. He helped Jake move the cattle from one pasture to another, his mere presence keeping the herd calm and organized. He stood patiently while children from the local school came to visit, learning about horse rescue and responsibility. And every evening, without fail, Thunder made a circuit of the property, checking on the remaining foals, ensuring all was well. One afternoon, a luxury car pulled up the driveway, unusual for the remote ranch. A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped out, introducing himself as Richard Sullivan, Margaret's estranged brother. Jake had heard from Sarah that Margaret had a brother she hadn't spoken to in over a decade, some family dispute that had never been resolved. Richard looked uncomfortable as he explained that he had only recently learned of his sister's death and what she had done in her final days. "I wasn't there for her when she needed me," Richard said, his voice thick with regret. "We had a stupid argument years ago, something I can't even remember now. Pride kept us apart, and now she's gone, and I never got to tell her I was sorry." He paused, looking out at the pasture where Thunder grazed with the remaining foals. "I heard about what happened here, about what you've done. I want to help. I want to do something to honor her memory." Jake studied the man carefully. He could see genuine remorse in Richard's eyes, a grief that went beyond simple loss. "Sometimes people don't realize what they have until it's gone," Jake said finally. "Your sister did something extraordinary here. She saved these animals when nobody else would, and she did it knowing she wouldn't be around to see them grow up. That takes a special kind of courage." Richard nodded, wiping at his eyes. "I'd like to set up a fund," he said, "in Margaret's name, for horse rescue, so that what she started here can continue, can help other horses that need saving." The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Horse Rescue Fund became a reality within 2 months. Richard donated a substantial sum to get it started, and the community added to it with fundraisers, charity auctions, and simple donations from people who had been moved by the story of Thunder and the Foals. The fund would help rescue organizations across the state, providing medical care, food, and shelter for horses that had nowhere else to go. It was a living legacy, ensuring that Margaret's final act of compassion would continue saving lives long after she was gone. Jake was asked to serve on the board of directors for the fund, a role he accepted with humility. He wasn't comfortable with the attention or the formal meetings, but he understood that his experience, his first-hand knowledge of what Margaret had accomplished, was valuable. More importantly, he wanted to make sure that the fund stayed true to Margaret's vision, that it helped the horses who needed it most, not just the ones that were easy or profitable to save. 6 months after Jake first discovered Thunder and the Foals at the old church, he made a pilgrimage back to that sacred place. He hadn't been there since the day he brought Thunder and the last foals home, and he felt drawn to return, to see it one more time, to pay his respects in his own way. He drove out in the early morning, just as he had that first day, with Thunder in the trailer behind him. When they arrived, Jake opened the trailer, and Thunder stepped out slowly, his hooves touching the same ground where he had stood guard for so long. The big horse lifted his head and looked at the church, his ears forward, his eyes taking in every detail. For a moment, Jake worried that being back here would traumatize Thunder, would bring back the stress and responsibility of those desperate days. But instead, Thunder walked calmly to the church entrance and simply stood there, quiet and contemplative, as if remembering. Jake walked inside the church, something he had only done briefly before in the chaos of the rescue. The hay was gone now, the makeshift stalls dismantled, the supplies removed. But Margaret's message was still there on the stone floor, the white chalk faded, but still visible. Jake knelt beside it, running his fingers over the words she had written with shaking hands in what must have been some of her final moments. The emotion hit him hard, and he found himself crying, really crying, for the first time since this whole journey began. He cried for Margaret, who had died alone with only her mission to comfort her. He cried for the 2 foals they couldn't save, for the innocents lost, and the battles that couldn't be won. He cried for Thunder, who had carried a burden no animal should have to bear. And he cried for himself, for the way this experience had cracked open something in his heart that he had kept locked away for years, a capacity for love and purpose that he thought he had lost. Thunder appeared in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning light. The horse walked over to Jake and lowered his head, pressing his forehead gently against the rancher's shoulder, just as he had done that day in the pasture. It was a gesture of comfort, of understanding, of shared grief and shared hope. Jake wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck and let himself feel everything, let the tears flow until they finally stopped. When Jake finally stood up, his legs stiff from kneeling on the hard stone floor, he made a decision. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of Margaret's message, wanting to preserve it before the chalk faded completely. Then he contacted a local stonemason and commissioned a permanent memorial to be placed at the church. It would tell Margaret's story, honor Thunder's devotion, and serve as a reminder to everyone who passed by that love and sacrifice can create miracles. The memorial was installed a month later, a beautiful bronze plaque mounted on the exterior wall of the church. It featured an image of a horse inspired by Thunder, surrounded by foals. The inscription read, "This church was the site of a modern miracle. Margaret Sullivan, dying of cancer and alone, brought 22 rescued foals here and entrusted their care to a horse named Thunder. For weeks, Thunder protected them, waiting for help to arrive." In October 2024, rancher Jake Morrison discovered them and, with the help of his community, saved 20 of the 22 foals. This memorial honors Margaret's sacrifice, Thunder's devotion, and the power of compassion to transform lives. At the dedication ceremony, nearly 200 people attended. There were reporters, rescue organizations, adoptive families with their foals who had grown into beautiful young horses, and community members who had volunteered their time and resources. Jake gave a short speech, his voice rough with emotion, thanking everyone who had helped. But the real star of the day was Thunder, who stood patiently while children pet him and adults took photos, the gentle giant who had saved so many lives simply by refusing to give up. As the sun set that evening and the crowds departed, Jake and Thunder stood alone at the church one final time. The rancher looked at the memorial, at the words that would tell this story for generations to come, and he felt a sense of peace. Margaret's final wish had been fulfilled. The foals had been given their chance at life, and Thunder, the faithful guardian, had finally found his own home, his own purpose beyond the mission that had defined him. Jake climbed into his truck and Thunder loaded into the trailer without hesitation, ready to return to the ranch that was now his forever home. As they drove away, Jake looked in the rearview mirror at the old church, its stone walls glowing in the fading light. It was no longer a place of abandonment and decay. It was a monument to love, to sacrifice, to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Thunder had kept his promise to Margaret, and Jake had kept his promise to them both. In the end, that was all that mattered. The guardian had found peace, the foals had found homes, and a dying woman's final act of love had created something beautiful that would endure long after they were all gone. Some promises, Jake thought as he drove into the sunset, are worth everything. Thank you for following this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others who believe in the power of compassion and the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals.